At her wedding, she called me a fat pig. Then her dad saw my millionaire friend. Mother story. They laughed first, a thin, brittle laugh from a table near the back, and then the tilt of conversation that comes when everyone thinks a joke has landed. The music kept playing, a string quartet, something slow and familiar, but for that moment the room narrowed to a single phrase, a single bright, ugly thing that cut the air between my son and his bride. "You're a fat pig," she said. Not whispered, not sotto voce, full-throated, smug, like she had practiced it between courses. Jessica Reynolds, in her cream silk and new last name, said it with the kind of certainty that belongs to people who believe their words will land and change the world. I turned. I had been halfway between the hors d'oeuvres and Dylan, holding my paper plate like a shield. The pearls around my throat, Thomas's pearls, caught the chandelier and flashed. For a second, I thought I must be hearing wrong. Then I felt Dylan's hand tighten on the back of my chair, felt the space between us grow. I felt guests pivot as if they had noticed a misaligned painting in someone else's house. There are moments you think you can imagine how you'll react. You picture a speech, a line that cuts clean and precise. You rehearse, privately, in the pantry or in the car. None of that mattered when the actual moment arrived. My mouth went dry. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. Smiles are useful. They buy a fraction of a second while you decide if you will implode or breathe. Jessica's laugh was small and sharp. "Oh, come on, Emily, it's the truth. He deserves better than a mother who reads off her donor list at dinner." She let the words hang, slung them like costume jewelry. It was not an accusation of fact so much as a performance. Everyone saw it for the performance it was meant to be. And then Robert Reynolds, Jessica's father, let out a sound that wasn't exactly a laugh. It was more like the dry rustle of a page. He had been standing near the bar, a tall, careful man whose suit had been tailored by someone who knew his business. He took a step forward and his face changed. I saw what he saw before he spoke. Not the pearls, not the dress, but the ledger in my son's hand. The subtle way a man holds himself when he has been raised to manage his own fortunes. "That's the woman who bought my company," he said. His voice carried. People turned like sheep to the shepherd. Emily Turner, the anonymous investor. She, with her friend, bought Reynolds Holdings. Conversation stopped, not because anyone wanted it to, but because the room realized a piece of history had been spoken aloud. The chord stops on a stage when the lead forgets the lyric. It's the collective hitch that sounds like being held underwater. I remember the string quartet almost impulsively playing louder to cover the silence. Someone coughed. My son looked at me with that look that combines horror and the desperate calculus of damage control. Jessica's smile collapsed. The woman who had been eager to humiliate now looked as though someone had taken away a prop. Her father, red-faced and proud, had connected dots that he had never meant anyone else to know. And then he did something I will never forget. He gestured to a man near the doorway, a leaned-back figure with a linen jacket and a posture that said he didn't need to be anyone's center of attention to be noticed. "Isn't that your millionaire friend?" Robert asked me, loud enough for the table to hear. It was a peculiar thing to say in a room full of people. Millionaire friend. The phrase landed like a stone in a pond. The ripples reached every face. Curiosity, envy, glee, and the old, quiet reckoning of futurity colliding with present embarrassment. People looked to the doorway. People looked to my friend, a man who had arrived with a quiet smile and then drifted into the perimeter where he could watch rather than be watched. His name was James Sullivan. He had been my financial advisor for more than a decade, yes, but he was also the friend who had seen my grief after Thomas died and sat with me on the porch with coffee until winter light softened. He had the kind of wealth that makes headlines in private journals and leaves no trace in your grocery cart. He also had the ability to be small when that served people better. He shrugged in a way that said he knew more about peripheral vision than the center stage. He slid off the linen jacket, folded it over his arm, and walked toward us. When he stood near my chair, it looked as if the room had gained a silent column of presence. Robert didn't wait to be polite. "James Sullivan," he announced, as if introducing his daughter's husband to an old rival. "You were part of that deal years ago, weren't you? Reynolds Holdings, sold out to an anonymous investor, bought up the rights. My lawyers still shake their heads when they remember the paperwork." The word anonymous had been the armor I'd chosen. I had preferred to hide, to be the gray woman at the edges of photos, to let Dylan's life be his and not a reflection of money. Thomas had wanted it that way. He had been an inventor, impatient with fanfare, possessed of that steady, absent-minded genius that the world either worships or misunderstands. When his patent sold for $25 million, we did not cast off our ordinary lives. We sold the rights, invested prudently, and built a quiet portfolio whose interest paid for the roof over our heads and the college tuition Dylan would pay for with his own hands. There is a huge difference between being rich and wanting to be seen as rich. I had chosen the latter. That choice, I have always said since, had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with preservation, of Dylan's sense of himself, of the memory of a husband who hated the attention, of the small rituals that had held our family together. None of that resonated with the woman who had called me what I was. To her, my invisibility was a wall to scale, a mystery to be unmasked, and later she would make clear she suspected there was leverage to be gained in exposing what I had spent years keeping private. After Robert spoke, the murmur in the room thickened. People muttered as if they were choosing teams. A cousin I barely knew came over to pat my arm and say how lovely it was that I'd been invited. Dylan's cheeks were pale. He laughed once, without humor. Jessica's hand found his elbow, as if to claim him again. "Your mother," Jessica said, with a smile that had the teeth of a trap. Who would have thought? That night is a cabinet of flickers, the clink of glasses, the way the floral arrangement smelled like wet sun, the sound of my son trying not to think aloud. I remember thinking, in the flight of it, that even if I had wanted to make a scene, to correct, to explain, to insist upon decency, that the best thing I could do was be what I'd always been, the calm center. So I stayed small. I let the cold wash over me, let James's presence act as a kind of steadiness. There are people who will mistake silence for submission. There are other people, like Jessica, who will think silence is an invitation. If you like true stories about secrets and family drama, hit like and subscribe. There are more nights like that, and I want to know who finds comfort in hearing how some of us choose to live with our choices. My story doesn't begin at the wedding. It begins in a small workshop on a chilly morning when Thomas handed me a sheaf of papers and said, almost casually, "This is probably worthless." He was wrong. The patent was not worthless. It was a sliver of the future, a neat piece of intellectual machinery that, once bought, multiplied into the kind of security that makes bedroom doors unlock easier at night. We sold those rights to a company that promised to take Thomas's invention into the world, and when they decided they needed cash for other ventures, the right person came along and paid handsomely. I spent the next 15 years building what looked like a modest life. I learned about index funds and the slow magic of compounding. I learned that cash in the bank says something to the world, but does not speak to the heart if it's only there for show. James and I sifted investments into durable assets, a bit of real estate, some municipal bonds, a careful private equity slice that paid dividends and never required my autograph on a glossy brochure. I became invisible by design. We moved to a house that felt like a home, not a statement. Dylan knew we were comfortable. He knew nothing of the sum total. He had his own job, his own pride. That was the point. When Thomas died, the quiet became more necessary than ever. Grief is a currency that is poorly invested in public. It attracts predators and pity in equal measure. People come bearing recipes and condolences, and some come with ledgers and expectations. I wanted neither. I wanted to protect. I wanted to keep the memory of Thomas clean from calculation. So I made a choice. Dylan would inherit one thing he had earned, the self-respect of having built his life, and the rest would be my responsibility to steward. I would do the dirty work of keeping the world at bay. For a long time, this worked. We were the people who had a modest home and enough for emergencies. We were the couple at church who brought bread, not chandeliers. People liked that about us. It gave Dylan room to become the man he wanted to be. He learned to change his own oil, to stand on his own 2 feet. He did not owe anyone explanation, and I was proud of that. Jessica shattered the little bubble we'd made without much more than a joke and an audience. We met the Reynolds at a neighborhood charity event a year before the wedding. Jessica was all energy, bright, rapid, ambitious. That was not a problem. People who aim high are useful. They move things. She was also the kind of person who had been taught that the proper allocation of social capital was a strategy, not a mistake.
Her parents were the archetypal moneyed Midwestern clan, polite, exacting, with a reputation in regional industry. Robert had been the owner of Reynolds Holdings, a family name that once meant boardrooms and contracts. He had sold control in pieces as market tide shifted. Pride, like water, seeks lower ground when it must. Jessica and Dylan fell in love in a way that felt as inevitable as weather. He was charmed by her brilliance and tired jokes. She loved that he could fix a leaky faucet and file taxes without drama. We celebrated the engagement with a small family dinner. I liked Jessica then. I thought she might be someone who would be good to my son. She was funny, decisive, articulate. Sometimes people hide what they want. Sometimes they reveal it too quickly. The wedding was meant to be an act of joining, an audience to say yes and vow. Instead, for one thin minute, it became an unveiling. Words have weight. People forget the way one remark can change years of careful negotiation with the world. After the reception, I did not go home. I sat in the car for a long time, feeling the hollow ache that followed the sudden exposure of something you meant to protect. Dylan drove us there. He didn't speak until the interstate had fewer headlights than a string of pearls. "I didn't know," he said finally. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" That is the question that has almost nothing to do with money and everything to do with the fragile calculus of parenthood. Why would I lie by omission to the person I loved more than my own breath?
My answer was not one that fit neatly on a napkin. I told him the truth as best I could, that Thomas would have hated headlines, that I promised to keep his name free of calculation, that I wanted him to be his own man. I told him that I believed there were things a parent must carry so a child could walk lighter. He listened, but the lines on his face deepened. He was 32 and deserved to decide what, if anything, he would accept from us. He was proud in a way that was a little stubborn. He wanted to feel he had earned his life. I understood that. I also knew, with the same cold intuition that had kept me awake at nights for a decade, that once someone else realized there was value to be had, the world would begin to measure him by whether he had inherited rather than what he had built. 3 days after the wedding, Jessica texted me a photo of a receipt and the caption, "So, how long have you been pretending you were broke?" She had the tone of someone gleeful at being clever. I deleted the message. Later that afternoon, Dylan called and said she had sent the screenshot to his mother-in-law and left a voicemail implying they had a right to know the source of help in their new lives. The initial bruise of humiliation had given way to a patter of precaution, mentions of lawyers, of curiosity from small circles, of bitterness that smelled like entitlement. When the first unknown number appeared on my phone, I answered it because refusal felt like starting to hide. The voice on the other end was cultivated, careful. "Miss Turner? This is Angela at Aguilar Investigations. We've been retained to do a background check regarding certain financial transfers that could be relevant to Reynolds Holdings. There's no accusation yet, but I thought you should know we're working on things." I remember 3 things about that call: the polite cadence of the investigator, the shallow relief that comes from naming a threat, and the cold realization that no accusation yet is the hinge on which reputations hang. If someone had put a gun to my head and asked me then whether I would choose peace or exposure, I would have said peace. But peace doesn't come when someone else has decided your privacy is a bargaining chip. I called James. He arrived within an hour, in his practical shoes and soft-spoken calm. He had known Thomas. He had helped me rebalance a portfolio during a recession. He had the kind of steady oversight that makes him valuable in ways you cannot always quantify. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, our kitchen where Thomas had once spilled motor oil into a flower pot, and listened. He didn't wince. He had the habit of listening in a way that made you feel like your words settled on a safe shelf. "We need to know what they have," I told him, "and what they intend." James rubbed his chin. "Do you want to play defense or offense?" I saw him as the friend in the doorway at the wedding in that instant, the man who could be massive without spectacle. He had been at enough negotiations, had mediated disputes where people's livelihoods were at stake. He knew that some fights you take, and some you walk away from, and sometimes the moral calculus is not simple. "Defense," I said, "for Dylan's sake, for Thomas's memory, for my peace." He nodded. Then we document, we trace, but importantly, we prevent escalation. If someone is fishing for leverage— "Jessica?" I said. He would not say her name like a weapon. He said instead what needed saying. There are people who will see exposure as victory. We have to remove the reason to continue fishing. How?
We start with paper. We see what they've opened. We ask for quiet. And he paused, as if choosing language. We consider what would neutralize a motive without rewarding bad behavior. Neutralize a motive without rewarding bad behavior. The phrase is a tightrope across a moral canyon. It is one thing to want someone to stop. It is another to pay them to be quiet. I had never wanted to be the kind of mother who purchased silence. This was not about dollars as justice. It was about preventing a slow, erosive damage to Dylan's ability to be who he wanted to be. Over the next week, we learned things in small, precise increments. Jessica had hired a private investigator, yes. The PI had compiled a file of innocuous-looking transfers and social media breadcrumbs that, filed together, could lead an enthusiastic reader to a conclusion. They had opened lines of credit under Dylan's name, not maliciously but presumptively, as if to tie him into a financial narrative that did not belong to him. A law firm had been engaged, Mark Vance, a young attorney recommended by a family friend. He wrote letters with the muscular civility of someone who had practiced asking for things politely before he learned to take them by force. And then there were the other things, a couple of anonymous tips to a regulator that suggested there might be irregularities in how a corporate acquisition had been reported, small but pointed inquiries that, if followed up, could require time and legal explanation. James told me to brace for the possibility of regulatory attention. SEC inquiries, he said, and then added, not necessarily damning, but costly in both money and reputation. The investigation process is a long, slow weathering. Say SEC in a living room of ordinary people, and you will see palms sweat. An inquiry isn't a conviction. It's a process that invites scrutiny and demands resources. It could expose things that had been carefully kept private, not because there was wrongdoing, but because the paperwork had been handled with an eye towards efficiency, not theatrical provenance.
James explained it patiently. Regulators ask for paperwork, counsel answers, and meanwhile, headlines are generated by people who want the moral arc to bend toward spectacle. At the same time, I realized that Jessica's actions were not purely strategic. There was a personal edge to them, a sense of entitlement that suggested she saw wealth as a rightful inheritance rather than an obligation or a tool of stewardship. She believed, at least in my interpretation, that by exposing us, she would accelerate Dylan's acceptance into the life she imagined for him. That sense of urgency made her dangerous in a particular way. She would not necessarily be content with the slow accumulation of trust. One night, as James and I sat in my living room going over bank statements that were dull to anyone who hadn't been responsible for them, Dylan walked in. He had been to a late shift at the brewery, and his hands still smelled faintly of hops. He sat down and listened. There is a particular look men get when they feel their authority undermined, but are still unsure of where blame properly belongs. He is ashamed for being affected, and furious that he has been made to look bought. "Mom," he said quietly, "did she say anything else? Did she threaten?" "Not yet," I said, "but she set a net in motion. That's what worries me." Dylan's shoulders dropped. "She can't do this to me. She can't make my career about my last name." "No," I said. "She can't. And she won't. I promise you I won't let her make you into a headline. Promises to your children are not the same as contracts. Promises are weathered by time and by choices. I made the promise because it was the only thing that sounded like a tether beneath a sky that had suddenly gone bright with attention. We moved into a mode I knew well. Documentation, gentle countermeasures, quiet communication. James wrote a note to Mark Vance's office, professional, measured, requesting they cease any further deleterious actions while we sought to understand motives. We made a record of the transfers. We instructed counsel that any regulatory correspondence would be met with full cooperation and transparency. The idea was to remove opacity so that there would be nothing to exploit. It did not work. 3 days after the letter, a short email arrived, a scanned image of a bank withdrawal with a note attached. "Just so you know what we have." The PI had been thorough. They had compiled fructifying pieces and passed them along like seeds on fresh soil. The email was anonymous but aggressive in its implication. "Know what we have." It felt like someone opening a closet and rearranging your things. I sat in the kitchen, and for the first time since Thomas had died, I felt something like panic. Not of the cinematic sort, no chest thumping,
but a slow, steady cold that crept into the marrow. My hands trembled as I poured tea.
James watched me with a look that said he had braced for this possibility, but that bracing does not immunize you from the ache. You could pay them off, he said finally. The silence that followed was large. It's amazing how money becomes a verb in a crisis. People who have never wanted to use it this way suddenly see it as a tool to stop bleeding. I had thought about it. Anyone in my position might. But the ethics of purchasing silence are an entanglement. If Jessica wanted leverage, paying would neutralize her now and teach her that leverage was profitable. That would set a dangerous precedent for the future, and for anyone who might, for whatever reason, think exposure is a path to reward. No, I said, I won't buy their silence. That feels like bribery of an ugly sort. But I also know I can't let this metastasize. We debated. We drafted replies that said little and promised cooperation. We strengthened our paper trail. We contacted a small, reputable firm that could manage regulatory correspondence. We tightened the narrative. We would not cower, but we would not broadcast. We would be steady. And yet, the threads tightened elsewhere. The Reynolds friends started asking awkward questions at neighborhood events, as if the curiosity of one household could be satisfied by the fall of another. Dylan's co-workers texted to say they'd heard rumors. The brewery's manager asked Dylan, somewhat awkwardly, if everything at home was okay. My son's life, his small routines, the rhythm of his days, began to show hairline cracks where the weight of other people's imagination had pressed against it. When you are the keeper of someone else's quiet, the hardest part is knowing where to place your defenses without taking away the person's dignity. None of my defenses were for me. They were for Dylan's ability to be judged by his own work. That, more than the fear of seeing Thomas's name in a headline, propelled me forward. Then the real blow came, a formal letter from a regulator, curt and bureaucratic, requesting documentation. No accusation, just process. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't expected. The letters require you to drop your normal life for a while. They require you to collect records, to account for things in a way you may never have anticipated. They create exposure by design. James leaned forward, steady as a lighthouse. These inquiries, he said, will not be easy, but they're not necessarily fatal. You cooperate, we respond. You show we have nothing to hide, but the world will watch. The phrase, the world will watch, is slippery. The world in this instance is small. Industry newsletters, a local business journal that likes to print power couple pieces, the parents who sit at PTA meetings and trade stories. But it feels like the world when your son's name is suddenly a ledger item. Reputation, once questioned, becomes a currency that you must spend careful thought on how to protect. Dylan folded in on himself for several days. He slept in the guest room, for reasons he couldn't explain to me beyond, I need to think without you seeing me. It is painful to watch your child struggle under the weight of choices you made for them. Even if those choices were meant to be sheltering, they can feel like shackles when someone else redefines them. Jessica, for her part, began to change. Where she had been all laughter and angles, her edges sharpened. She started to speak with the coolness of someone who had tasted leverage. Her father, I noticed, had become more hesitant, as if he were watching a chessboard and unsure whether his daughter had the patience for slow games or merely wanted instant victory. Then came the letter from Mark Vance that closed around us like a vice. It was polite, professional, but firm. There were questions to be answered, and they expected a conversation. It seemed on the surface an offer to negotiate. In truth, it was an opening move. Negotiation is a dance where people size up your willingness to settle. In the days that followed, everyone began to posture. I remember sitting on my porch one evening, watching an ordinary dog walker pass, and thinking of Thomas standing over an old workbench, hands stained with oil, unbothered by finance. He had invented the thing because he wanted to make people's lives easier, not to fund headlines. That steadied me. It reminded me that some forms of power are better served in silence. But the silence was broken now. Jessica had chosen to make me small in order to make herself larger, and once that process began, it gathered momentum. It became clear to me in a way that frightened me. This was not merely about pride or curiosity. She had constructed a strategy. She had asked someone to look for leverage and had been complicit in setting things in motion that could harm Dylan's autonomy. We had to respond, not for the money, but for the dignity of the life Dylan had built. I called James and told him I wanted options. He brought a folder of possibilities, defensive legal maneuvers, offers that would resolve immediate disputes.
measures to shore up reputation without paying for silence. He was careful, as all good advisors are, to outline risks. There are no guarantees, he said. There are consequences to every path, and sometimes the consequences are delays and expense. Then give me the path that preserves his dignity, I said. We made a plan to confront the leverage directly but quietly, a cleanup of paper, a display of transparency, an offer to settle specific, narrow points without admitting culpability or paying for silence in a way that would reward coercion. It was messy, delicate, and ethical in the difficult sense of the word. We did not want to gloat. We did not want revenge. We wanted stability. What I did not fully appreciate then was how much of the fight would be about perception. That once someone decided you were a prize, a narrative would be manufactured to justify their claim.
It was not the facts alone that mattered. It was the story told around them. For Jessica and her father, that story included a sense of entitlement tethered to familial legacy. For me, the story was a quiet stewardship that had never needed to be told. At the end of that week, James looked at me and said the words I had been both waiting for and dreading. They want a negotiation. Negotiation, as I've learned, is a form of conversation that can heal or it can hollow out, depending on the motives at the table. If the other side seeks to destroy, negotiation is a delay. If they want to resolve, negotiation is a path. Our task then was to discover which it would be. I tucked the folder into my bag and thought of Thomas. I thought of the years of living small to protect the people I loved. I thought, shakily, of the glamour the world might imagine in our house, how easily a life can be misread. That night, before I went to bed, I opened a small red box where I kept one of Thomas's drawings. It was a sketch of the first prototype, scribbled in pencil. There was no glory in the lines, only the slow patience of someone designing something to be useful. I ran my finger over the pencil marks and felt a kind of resolve settle like dust. You do this right, I told James the next morning, and you keep it quiet. He folded his hands. Right, he said. We keep it quiet until it's time to be not quiet. There were some things I would not compromise, but I would also not let someone turn my son into a spectacle for their ambition. The phone rang. It was a blocked number. On the other end, a voice that sounded rehearsed said, "We have a meeting scheduled to discuss this matter. Are you prepared to negotiate?" I closed my eyes and thought of the wedding hall, of pearls flashing, of a daughter-in-law with a practiced smile. I thought of dignity. I thought of protection. Yes, I said, I'm prepared, but I am not prepared to be bullied. There was a pause on the line, like a horse waiting for a rider. Then, good, bring your counsel. I hung up and looked at James. There would be a meeting. There would be negotiations. There would be choices that would test whether privacy is a right or a commodity. We scheduled a conversation through attorneys. The date was set for a week out. Between now and then, I had to do what I'd always done when there was a storm on the horizon. Gather facts, study my son, and remember the reason behind our choice to stay small in the first place. But even as we prepared for the meeting, another bone of unease lodged in my throat. The question that would not leave me was not about money. It was about motive. What makes a person decide to expose another's life? Is it greed? Insecurity? A desire to claim what they think is theirs? For Jessica, I suspected there was a mixture. A belief in birthright, a hunger for security, and a hunger for recognition. For Robert, perhaps a wounded pride.
But in the quiet moments before confrontation, I realized that this was not only about them, it was about the brittle way our culture measures worth, and how easily a person's life can be reduced to a balance sheet. I would prepare my case, not because I delighted in proving a point, but because I had the responsibility to ensure my son's life remained his. The wedding had been a public theater. Now the theater extended to letters and subpoenas and the slow bureaucratic hum of agencies doing their work. We had to be ready. And so we did what we had always done. We organized, documented, and braced for the first move. We would not be naked in the public square. We would be deliberate. We would be protective. We would not let humiliation be the currency that determined my son's fate. The next morning, an envelope arrived at the house. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Dylan at his bachelor party months ago, laughing with friends, holding a beer. Someone had taken the photo from a social account and printed it. On the back, in a handwriting meant to be casual, were 2 words: "Start here." I felt the old, visceral instinct that tries to armor a child with your own skin. Rage flickered, brief and controlled. Then I folded the photograph, slipped it into my pocket, and drove to James's office. There were meetings to be had, and a mother cannot fight with the heat of rage. She must fight with the coolness of strategy. We sat across from each other, 2 people who had never needed to be dramatic, and planned our first defense. The meeting would be formal. It would be civil. It would also be a test. Did Jessica want resolution or escalation? As I left James's office, the sky had that hard, clear quality of late fall. Leaves skittered down the sidewalk like small brown notes. I thought about the way the Reynolds wedding had changed everything with one sentence. I thought about how quickly a single phrase can rewrite the architecture of a life. I drove home slowly, my mind cataloging the ways one could defend a life. The phone on the passenger seat vibrated and the screen flashed a message from an unknown number. "You won't get away with this." I pulled over. My hands were steady. I texted back simply, "We aren't trying to. We're trying to live." The response came quickly. Live on what? On lies. I had no desire to explain myself to someone who had decided a narrative. I deleted the text and set the phone on the seat. For the sake of Dylan's future, for the name of the man who had made a thing that improved lives, for my own desire to live small and kindly, I would not be baited into an unseemly spectacle. We had 1 week until the meeting. We would prepare. The next moves would make clear what Jessica and her allies intended. In the meantime, I called my brother and asked him to meet Dylan for dinner. I called a cousin to sit with me on the afternoon of the hearing. Company is a strange kind of armor. I found myself making lists of things I never thought I'd do again. What bank statements to print, which receipts to pull, which emails to archive. On the morning of the meeting, the house felt like a patient waiting room. The kettle sang. Dylan came downstairs and made coffee. He moved with the slow dignity of someone who cannot be rushed into decisions. We sat at the table and didn't talk at first. There are some moments when the right words are those not spoken. When Dylan finally did speak, his voice was low. "If this goes sideways," he said, "I don't want you to think you did me harm by keeping things quiet." I reached for his hand across the table. He squeezed. "I know that," I said, "and I would do it again, but I don't have to like how it looks. I don't have to accept someone making you into a headline." He sighed, then stood. "Then we make sure the headline is that she accepted a sensible agreement and moved on." We drove to the law offices in separate cars. James and I kept to the back of the conference room. Dylan sat closest to the window, the light drawing a pale line down his face. Across from us, Mark Vance sat like a man who enjoyed words the way some men enjoy maps. He saw routes and possibilities. Robert Reynolds filled a chair as if he could anchor it with his presence. Paula, his wife, hovered at his shoulder like wallpaper with a practiced smile. Jessica arrived late, hair immaculate, eyes bright with the brittle sheen of someone who had been preparing for a verdict. The first part of such meetings is always the smallest: names, pleasantries, the polite clearing of throats. Then the air thickens, because the politeness is a vessel carrying appetite. "Miss Turner," Mark said, opening a folder with the same reverence one gives a hymn, "we understand you have been sitting on assets that relate to the Reynolds' past interest in various holdings. Our clients simply seek clarity and, if warranted, appropriate restitution." He used the word restitution like a scalpel wrapped in velvet. I felt Dylan's hand press against the tabletop, not to take mine, but to ground himself. James answered first, calmly, with the kind of tone that makes people listen because they know they're being offered reality rather than rhetoric. "There's nothing nefarious here," he said. "Miss Turner purchased shares in a private sale. All appropriate documents were filed through counsel at the time. We have nothing to hide and will cooperate with any legitimate inquiry. But if this is an attempt to extract leverage by implication or rumor, then the proper remedy is a narrow settlement to protect reputations and move everyone forward." Jessica's mouth was a thin line. She had that look people get when they are deciding whether to press a point or to retreat and rehearse it later at cocktail parties. Robert cleared his throat. "We're simply asking for transparency," he said. "Our family has been affected by rumors."
"It seems reasonable to ask that the matter be clarified," Mark finished, eyes on me like scales. "We propose a structure that would allow for closure." There it was, the enticement of closure. Closure is a velvet glove on a stone. I listened, waiting for an ask. People who covet something rarely disclose their bottom line first. They leave it like bait. Mark spoke of sums and ranges, phrases like damages, compensation for distress, legacy concerns, and left a silence for us to fill. James had prepared for this. He spoke like a man who'd seen such bait laid often. "We're not here to litigate drama," James said. "We're here to protect a young man's right to be known for his labor. Miss Turner is willing to consider an offer that secures the Reynolds' immediate stability and provides a clean break, one that explicitly releases all parties from future claims related to this matter." "How much?" Robert asked, as if the word itself was a key. James looked at me, then back at Mark. $5 million, payable in a trust that ensures liquidity for the Reynolds family for 3 years, and then converts to an educational and community fund. It comes with a binding non-contact provision and a release of all claims. No admission of wrongdoing, no press statement from our side. We arrange for confidentiality in the mechanics of the transfer, and then everyone moves on. The number landed with varying sounds around the table. Someone's pen clicked, a chair scraped. Jessica's hand tightened into a white knot. I could see the muscles at her jaw working as if she were masticating a bitter thought. Mark inhaled. $5 million to what end? Is this a buy-off? Is it hush money? "It's not a bribe," James said quietly. "It's a strategic settlement. It neutralizes incentive. It stabilizes the family without inviting spectacle. It avoids litigation. It avoids protracted regulatory attention that could be more damaging to all parties." Mark sat back and considered. People who have the attorney's art know that the act of considering is itself a negotiation. He asked a dozen small procedural questions about timing and structure. Robert asked one big one. "Why would you give us any money if there's no wrongdoing?" "Because you threatened a process that would claim damages to Mr. Turner's reputation and cause sustained cost to his family," James said. "Because sometimes it is less about rightness and more about stopping someone from tearing a life apart." Jessica stood up then. She had the fragile composure of someone who had been rehearsing outrage. "So you want to buy our silence," she said. Her voice trembled on purpose. The theatrical version of shock is always a tool. "No one is buying silence," I said before I could think. My voice was steadier than I felt. "I'm offering protection for my son. If you had asked a week ago, we might have found a way to speak frankly without threats. But once a private investigator writes an email with an anonymous attachment and a regulator receives an anonymous tip, the cost is real." Paula, whom I had always seen as socially adept and often removed, surprised me by speaking with plainness. "This has been terribly painful," she said. "If there is a way to resolve it that isn't litigious, that's what I'd like, for Dylan's sake." Dylan's face was quiet. He had a weary look I recognized from the man he was becoming, the look of someone marinating in adult decisions that used to remain the province of parents. "If this stops things," he said, "then that's what matters most. My life is my life. I don't want it dragged under." It was Jessica's eyes that told the rest of the story. For a blink, she looked like a young woman who had expected to ascend by marrying into a life she had been taught she had a claim to. Then she looked like someone whose path had been complicated by the reality that her husband was allergic to being purchased. "How about $5 million, and you stop calling it a settlement," Mark offered. "You call it a goodwill payment, and we'll be done." James's laugh was soft. "Call it what you want. We'll call it a settlement with a release. The mechanics are what matter. We want closure, and we want you to withdraw any pending leverage, letters to regulators, subpoenas, any public accusations." A long silence then. Robert looked at his daughter. She looked back as if expecting a lifeline he might not throw. For all his public pride, he wanted a solution that repaired the public face of his family. Jason and Paula exchanged a glance across a gulf they'd grown between them. Finally, Jessica spoke in a voice that was less practiced and more raw than I'd heard before. She faltered. "I thought Dylan deserved someone who could provide." The words leaked out not as accusation but as confession. Life rarely gives you script lines that explain the motives behind one's appetite. Often you get small, naked admissions that are more damaging than any rhetoric. "He has you," I said. "He has his work, his life, his choices. He doesn't need to be purchased." It was a scene of small reckonings. Mark closed his folder. He took a breath and said, "We will take your offer to my clients." They left the room briefly to confer. The minutes stretched like the spaces between trains, an anxious waiting for something that makes noise when it arrives. Dylan touched my hand under the table. "Are you okay?" he asked, as if the word could be unwrapped into comfort. "I'm as okay as I can be," I whispered. "We're going to make sure you get to be you." When they returned, Mark and Robert had lined faces, as if negotiation were a job that required one to compress emotion into dullness. "My clients accept,"
Mark said finally. We will draft terms, but understand this. The acceptance comes with expectations. We expect compliance with the transfer and the release.
We expect your cooperation in providing documentation to close any investigations on an administrative basis. We all signed what had to be signed in the coming days: letters of intent, outlines of trusts, a non-contact clause, a release that was careful in words and absolute in effect. James and I insisted on language that protected Dylan's autonomy, that prevented future claims by anyone to tie him to money that wasn't his to own unless he desired it. There was a part of me that felt sick to my stomach as the funds moved through channels and accounts. I had not wanted to be the kind of mother who solved a problem with cash, but what I wanted more than aesthetics was to empty the room of leverage. The settlement did that. It bought a clean line. Their side accepted the funds, removed their complaints, and agreed to a permanent non-contact arrangement with Dylan and me. When the lawyer called to say the transfer had cleared, I sat on the porch steps and listened to the street. Someone came by with a stroller, another with a dog. It sounded like ordinary life was trying to resume itself. The relief I expected was there, but it was edged, like a patch sewn over a hole, not seamless, but serviceable. And yet, even as the immediate threat had been neutralized, the moral tangle remained. Dylan's marriage did not survive the exposure. The hole that had been made by public humiliation had begun to collapse inward. It wasn't the money that broke it. It was the revealing of difference that had introduced doubt into the marriage's foundation. Pride, entitlement, the mismatch of values, those are not easily repaired with practicalities or polite settlements. It was painful to watch them sign the papers to separate. The divorce was civil and mutual in its finality, but neither of them left with the quiet dignity I'd wished. There is no satisfaction in being proven right at the cost of your child's heartbreak. There is no applause for a mother who saves a son only to see him walk away wounded. Dylan took his time. He moved out of the house we had shared and into a small rental with a backyard and room for his tools. He took, as they say in honest families, his things and his pride. He remained civil towards Jessica for a while, but the distance became concrete. Slowly, with a patient rhythm, he started to rebuild. He found a woman named Sarah at a local co-op, someone who liked that he could make sourdough and who did not ask about his bank accounts. Their courtship was gentle and rooted not in shapes of inheritance, but in the kind of companionable smallness that had been my design for him all along. Meanwhile, the regulatory inquiry moved through slower channels. The SEC correspondence required us to provide documentation and explanations. James and our counsel worked with consummate care, filing records, producing materials, answering questions. It was not a dramatic exoneration. We did not appear on the front pages with trumpeting trumpets.
It was instead a long drainage of attention. There were fees and days lost to meetings, and a nagging knowledge that even when the letter stopped, the scent of attention lingers like perfume. Months later, the regulators closed the inquiry with no enforcement action. They wrote that after review, no impropriety had been found that warranted further action. That sentence is both a relief and a reminder. The absence of action is not the same as applause. We had been through a sieve and come out on the other side, but the ordeal had cost more than money. It had cost time, luck, and a certain refusal to be naive about how people weaponize curiosity. In the aftermath, something else happened that I had not anticipated. The Reynolds family retreated into themselves. Public opinion, fickle as it is, turned in small ways. There were articles about family drama and the awkward $1 million settlement. People like to reduce human complexity into headlines because headlines are comfortable. They make tenderness unreadable. Jessica did not become a caricature of cruelty afterward. She had moments of regret, to be sure, and of brittle defense. Robert took to quieter charity work and sometimes sent a card at holidays. Paula called once to check on Dylan, an act that felt like an olive branch, and also a small confession of the social costs they'd paid for their ambition. As for me, I found that the money did not change the small habits that kept me human. I still made tea in the same chipped pot. I still kept Thomas's drawing in a red box and brought it out on hard days. But there was a desire to redirect, to take the instrument of security and turn it towards something that honored Thomas's original impulse, to make people's lives better, not to enrich vanity. James and I created the Thomas Fund with a clause of anonymity that I insisted upon. It would be small in public profile and deep in actual utility. The idea was simple: provide scholarships and grants for young engineers and inventors, people with ideas but not capital, so that their inventions might be improved and carried into the world responsibly. We hired a small local committee of professors and community leaders to advise the grants. We made sure it was not an instrument for PR. The fund did not announce itself with fanfare. It sent quiet checks and paid tuition, and sometimes bought the tools a young inventor needed to build a prototype. I remember the first letter I received from a grantee. It was from a woman named May, a grad student who had designed a low-cost water filter for rural clinics. She wrote with the mixture of gratitude and disbelief that makes reading mail a small ritual of grace. She told a story of working in a dorm room soldering components by the light of a desk lamp, and of how a modest grant had turned those soldered pieces into something that could be tested in the field. We tested in a clinic in Nevada County, she wrote.
The nurses cried when the water ran clean on the first try. Thank you, Miss Turner. There are moments in life when the arithmetic of pain and joy equalizes into a kind of peace. We had been through humiliation and threat and the grinding mechanics of defense. We had also, it turned out, been given an opportunity to direct resources to people who would do something better with them than we ever could for ourselves. That decision felt like repair. I moved to Santa Fe after selling the house. The town was quieter than the place we'd left. It had a southwestern light that made even ordinary bricks look dignified. My days took on new shape. Mornings at the farmer's market, where men sold chiles and women sold hand-thrown pottery. Afternoons at the small community center, where I volunteered to review grant applications with real people who asked smart questions. Evenings reading by a window that showed a sky so big you could forget petty world noise for a while. The Thomas Fund had rules. Grants were anonymous to the public, and recipients were encouraged to share credit with their teams. The idea was to build community, not celebrities. We wanted to fund the labor of good ideas, not to build a pedestal. There were small, tender joys. Dylan would visit for holidays with Sarah now at his side. They brought sourdough bread and sometimes a jar of pickles. We would sit around the worn kitchen table and talk about small things, what seeds to plant this year, whether the neighbor's dog needed a sweater. He was different in the way that matters, quieter, more himself. The warped lines on his face softened. He told me once over coffee, I learned something I didn't think I'd learn, that my mother kept a secret not to be powerful, but to let me be. I don't know if I can forgive everything, but I understand why you did it. What a relief to be understood. Forgiveness is a slow therapy. It is a blooming, not an event. It may not return things to their original design, but it is the only thing that lets you keep living. Jessica moved away from our small circle of acquaintances. I've seen her at town events, rocking a determined profile, and I sometimes think of what a different life she might have had if she had learned to see money as a tool rather than a ladder. Pride is its own pedagogy. People are taught to see leverage as merit. There is a certain sadness in recognizing how many lives are bent around that misunderstanding. I have thought often about the moral calculus that led me to settle. I did not enjoy making a payment to extract a family from tension. I did not relish any sense of victory. I made a pragmatic choice to preserve a life I had helped build. Call it what you will: settlement, payment, protection. It was not an act of revenge. It was an act of stewardship. Stewardship is a word that doesn't taste of glamour. It tastes of beans cooked slowly and of oil on your hands. It is the choice to maintain rather than to dominate. It is the preference for the steady over the spectacular. There were days when people would ask me in small, private moments whether I regretted the secrecy. My answer is never simple. Secrecy, when chosen to protect someone, can be a kindness. But secrecy can also be an impoverishment if it robs people of the dignity of knowing the truth on their terms. We chose secrecy because we believed that Dylan's life should be his, not a spectacle. That belief cost us moments of awkwardness and trust. It also saved him from being measured by the wrong yardstick. What would I have done differently? Perhaps I would have told him earlier in measured ways, letting him carry his heritage as one instrument among many, rather than a specter in the corner. Perhaps better conversations earlier would have prevented Jessica from constructing leverage out of curiosity. Hindsight is a quiet surgeon. There are other lessons. Money is a blunt instrument for solving relational wounds. It mends certain practicalities, but does not sew up the emotional seams.
There's a humility in knowing that wealth can purchase safety, or it can purchase shame. The choice depends on who wields it and why. I sometimes speak at local groups about stewardship and about the quiet ways we can use resources to build bridges rather than pedestals. People lean forward at such talks because they want practical wisdom divorced from ostentation. They want to know how to live with integrity if fortune comes their way. I tell them a story about Thomas and the bench and the patent, and I remind them that most of the work is not dramatic. It is the patient accumulation of small acts. Once an old friend asked, bluntly, "Was it worth it, Emily? The secrecy, the fight, the settlement?" I thought about the mornings when I'd wake and find a note from a grantee describing a small triumph, or the sound of Dylan laughing in his kitchen, or the clean water running through a clinic washer someone funded through one of my grants. Those were the measures that mattered. Yes, I said carefully, it was worth it because it preserved a life and turned a threat into a tool for others. I often return in my mind to that night in the wedding hall when a single sentence bent the room towards something ugly. I can still see a chandelier reflecting in Thomas's pearls and hear the quartet trying to fill a sudden silence. That image is not what defines me. What defines me is what I did after that sentence, how I decided to respond. If you ask whether the settlement ruined someone's life, the answer is complicated. It changed trajectories, yes. People made choices, and those choices had consequences. But justice, as I have learned, is not always a perfect symmetry. Sometimes the best you can do is choose a path that creates the fewest lasting wounds. In Santa Fe, there's a small square where an artisan sells hand-painted tiles. I bought one with a simple motif, a lone bird in flight, and nailed it by my back door.
It is not ostentatious. It is a reminder that freedom is small and quiet. My freedom now is to spend afternoons teaching a young engineer how to talk to a grant committee without sounding like a petition, to write checks that fund utility rather than vanity, and to walk in a market where nobody knows the size of my bank account, and frankly, they don't care. Has the world been kinder to me since? Not necessarily. People can never be entirely kind about wealth. They are complicated instruments of aspiration, envy, and sometimes generosity. But my life has been steadier. I have been lucky to find moments of genuine joy. When I reflect on the arc from the wedding hall to the Thomas Fund, a few images keep returning. The first is of Thomas at his bench, hands in oil and focused on making the world a bit easier. The second is the image of Dylan, standing at the kitchen table years later, choosing a life of small rituals. The third is of May in her clinic, watching water run clear for the first time. Those images are a kind of answer to the question of why privacy mattered to me in the first place. It wasn't to hoard. It was to give things space to become useful. If there is a moral to the story, it's not one of triumphalism. It's a complicated lesson. Protect privacy when it preserves autonomy, but consider the cost of secrecy. Use wealth to restore dignity, not to purchase silence as a habit. When forced into conflict, choose stewardship over spectacle. People sometimes ask what I would tell a younger woman who finds herself unexpectedly wealthy. I tell them this. Decide early what your money exists for. Keep your commitments simple. Use advisors you trust. Most importantly, remember that money can shield or it can expose. It can build a life or it can become the axis on which your relationships spin. Choose intentionally. The last line in this story is not a trumpet. It is a small prayer. I believe in the quiet curative power of good work. I believe in stewardship more than in the language of reward. I believe that the best revenge is to thrive in ways that match your values, without malice and without spectacle. God has been kind to me in strange ways, and I am grateful for the chance to redirect what came to us to people who will do good with it. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have spoken earlier? Would you have kept the secret? Tell me in the comments below. I'm always interested in hearing how others weigh privacy, family, and responsibility. If you want to see 2 more stories about hidden fortunes and hard choices, check the end screen for the next videos.